The decision to move to Oak Ridge Estates was not one I made lightly. After 15 years in law enforcement and 10 as the county sheriff, I had seen the worst of humanity and carried the weight of that knowledge home each night. But this neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes, seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start, especially for Emma. My daughter Emma was born with a rare form of muscular dystrophy. The condition affects her mobility and causes chronic pain, especially in her ribcage and back. At 16, she had already endured more surgeries than most people face in a lifetime. The specialists recommended regular physical therapy and outdoor activity to maintain muscle strength, which is why the spacious backyard of our new home seemed so perfect. The neighbors welcomed us with homemade pies and warm smiles when we arrived 6 months ago. The Johnsons to our left invited us to their weekend barbecue. The elderly couple across the street, the Millers, brought over a handwritten list of the best local doctors. It felt like a community, something Emma and I had been missing since my wife passed away 3 years ago. During our first week, a woman with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and expensive tennis clothes knocked on our door with a welcome packet. "I am Catherine Matthews, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association," she said with a smile that displayed professionally whitened teeth. "But everyone calls me Karen. We are so pleased to have a law enforcement officer joining our community. Safety is our #1 priority here." She handed me a 3-ring binder filled with HOA regulations, architectural guidelines, and landscaping restrictions. "Just standard procedures to keep property values high," she explained, her eyes drifting past me to scan our half-unpacked living room. "The monthly meetings are the first Tuesday at the community center. We expect full participation from all homeowners." I nodded politely, explaining that my schedule as county sheriff often included unpredictable hours. "I will try my best, but my work can be demanding." Something flickered across her face, displeasure perhaps, but it vanished so quickly behind her smile that I dismissed it. "Of course," she said, "we understand completely." Within weeks, Emma had transformed the backyard into her sanctuary. With help from her physical therapist, we designed raised garden beds at the perfect height for her to tend from her wheelchair on bad days or while standing during better ones. The repetitive motions of digging, planting, and watering strengthened her muscles without the clinical feeling of therapy exercises. The first time I saw her smile since the move was when the sunflowers she planted began to bloom. "Dad, look," she called from the garden one evening as I returned from work. "They are taller than me now." Her face was flushed with pride and exertion, a healthy color I had not seen in months. I did not notice Karen watching from across the street, standing motionless on her perfect lawn, clipboard in hand, eyes narrowed as she studied our backyard modifications. I did not see her taking notes or notice how her gaze lingered on the raised beds, the wheelchair-accessible paths, or the bench we had installed near the vegetable section. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I worked long hours keeping the county safe while Emma attended her new school and tended to her garden. For the first time in years, I felt hope taking root alongside Emma's plants. But like the hairline cracks in a seemingly perfect foundation, trouble was forming beneath the surface of our peaceful new beginning. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, official HOA letterhead gleaming under the kitchen lights. "Notice of violation," the bold letters proclaimed. I opened it while drinking my morning coffee, expecting some minor issue easily resolved. Instead, I found a 3-page document detailing multiple infractions regarding our backyard garden. Unauthorized structural modifications, non-compliant planting beds, excessive vegetation height, improper placement of gardening equipment. The list continued with citations from various sections of the HOA regulations. At the bottom, a $250 fine was noted, along with a 14-day compliance deadline. Emma entered the kitchen as I was reading. "What is that?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of orange juice. Her movements were stiff that morning, a sign her pain levels were elevated. "Nothing important," I lied, folding the letter and tucking it into my uniform pocket. "Just some paperwork from the HOA." Her garden was the one thing bringing her consistent joy. I would not allow bureaucratic nonsense to take that away. That afternoon, I visited Karen Matthews at her immaculate colonial-style home. Her garden featured perfectly trimmed hedges and mathematically spaced flowers, all identical heights and colors. Nothing grew out of place. Nothing existed without apparent purpose or planning. Karen received me on her front porch rather than inviting me inside. She stood with perfect posture, lips curved into a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. "Sheriff Davis, what can I do for you today?" I explained about Emma's condition and the therapeutic purpose of the garden. "The modifications are medically necessary. Her physical therapist designed them specifically for her needs." Karen nodded with manufactured sympathy. "I understand completely. Medical issues are so difficult. However, rules exist for a reason. The covenant clearly states that all exterior modifications require prior approval from the architectural committee." "I was not aware gardening beds required approval," I responded. "They are not permanent structures." Her smile tightened. Section 7, Paragraph 3 specifically addresses landscape alterations exceeding standard residential gardening. I would be happy to point it out in your copy of the regulations. She gestured toward her door. "Did you bring it with you?" I had not, of course. The three-ring binder remained untouched on a shelf in our home. "Unfortunately, exceptions cannot be made without establishing precedent," she continued. "Perhaps you could attend the next meeting and present your case to the full board." I explained again about my unpredictable schedule, how my duties as sheriff often prevented me from attending evening meetings. "How unfortunate," Karen said, checking her designer watch. "Well, the rules do apply equally to everyone. That is what makes our neighborhood so special." She smiled that empty smile again. "I am sure we can find a solution that maintains both your daughter's needs and our community standards." Over the next few weeks, more violation notices arrived. The fines increased with each letter. I tried calling other HOA board members, but messages went unreturned. Meanwhile, I began noticing Karen walking past our house multiple times daily, phone in hand, photographing our yard from different angles. Mrs. Miller, the elderly neighbor across the street, caught me retrieving the mail one afternoon. "Be careful with that one," she whispered, nodding toward Karen's house. "She has it out for anyone who misses meetings or questions her authority. Last year, the Thompsons had a son with autism who needed a special swing in their backyard. Karen made their lives miserable until they moved." That evening, I found Emma sitting on her garden bench, shoulders slumped. "Dad, someone has been taking pictures of my garden. I saw her this morning while you were at work." The peaceful neighborhood we had chosen was revealing its true nature. What had once felt like a sanctuary was becoming a battleground, with my daughter's well-being caught in the crossfire. That Thursday started like any other. I left for work at dawn, checking on Emma before departing. "Remember your physical therapy exercises," I reminded her as she sleepily nodded from beneath her blankets. "And do not overdo it in the garden today. The forecast says it will be hot." My shift was routine: a minor traffic accident on County Road 16, paperwork at the station, A meeting with the district attorney about an upcoming case. Nothing suggested it would become the worst day of my life since losing my wife. Emma later told me she had been in the garden since mid-morning, carefully tending to her vegetables and flowers. The repetitive motions of weeding and watering provided relief for her aching muscles. Her physical therapist had emphasized how these natural movements were superior to clinical exercises. The garden was truly her medicine. The sound of the garden gate latch clicking open interrupted her work. Emma looked up, squinting against the sunlight, to see Karen Matthews entering our backyard uninvited. She carried garden shears in one hand and a clipboard in the other. "Excuse me," Emma called out, struggling to stand from her kneeling position. On good days she could move with only a slight limp. This was not one of those days. "This is private property. You cannot just come in here." Karen barely acknowledged her. "I have documented multiple violations that have gone unaddressed," she stated flatly, moving toward the raised sunflower bed. "Since your father has chosen to ignore official notices, the HOA bylaws allow for remediation of violations after the 30-day grace period." "What are you talking about?" Emma asked, confusion and alarm rising in her voice. "Those are my plants. You cannot touch them." Karen began methodically cutting down the tallest sunflowers, the ones Emma had nurtured for months, the ones that stood like bright sentinels along the garden's edge. Section 12.4 clearly states that no vegetation may exceed 6 feet in residential areas without special approval. "Stop," Emma cried, moving as quickly as her condition allowed. "Those are part of my therapy garden. My dad will file the paperwork. Just stop cutting them." Karen continued her destruction, moving from the sunflowers to the tomato trellises. These structures exceed the allowable height and were installed without approval from the architectural committee. Emma reached for the shears, desperation overcoming her usual shyness. "Please stop. You are destroying months of work." What happened next occurred in terrible slow motion, according to the neighbors who witnessed it from their windows and porches. As Emma reached for Karen's arm, Karen twisted away sharply. The garden shears, professional grade and razor sharp, caught Emma across her ribcage. The scream that tore through our peaceful neighborhood caused Mrs. Miller to call 911 immediately. "A child has been hurt," she told the dispatcher. "Send an ambulance to 1467 Oak Ridge Lane right away." Emma collapsed among her destroyed plants, blood spreading across her light blue t-shirt. The pain was excruciating, particularly because of her condition. Where an ordinary cut might have been manageable, for Emma, any trauma near her already compromised ribcage was potentially dangerous. Karen stood frozen, the bloody shears still in her hand. Then, as neighbors began emerging from their homes, her shock transformed into self-preservation. "She attacked me," Karen announced loudly. "I was performing official HOA duties and she became violent. It was self-defense." I was conducting a routine traffic stop when the call came through my radio. "All units be advised. Injury reported at 1467 Oak Ridge Lane. Possible assault with a weapon. Ambulance en route." My blood turned to ice. That was my address. That was Emma. I activated my patrol car's lights and siren, radioing dispatch that I was responding immediately to the scene. The 10-minute drive home was the longest of my life, my mind racing through terrible possibilities. When I pulled up, 2 patrol officers from my department were already securing the scene. An ambulance sat in my driveway, its rear doors open. And there, in the midst of the destroyed garden, paramedics worked on my daughter while Karen Matthews stood to the side, speaking animatedly to Officer Reynolds. I abandoned my vehicle and ran toward Emma, my heart pounding in my chest. What happened? Emma. My daughter lay pale and trembling on a gurney, an oxygen mask over her face. Dad, she whispered as I reached her side. She cut down my sunflowers. When I tried to stop her, tears streamed down her face. The paramedic looked up at me. Sheriff Davis, she has a laceration approximately 4 inches long across her ribcage. Given her medical condition, we need to transport her immediately for evaluation. I nodded, squeezing Emma's hand. I will be right behind you. Only then did I turn toward Karen, who was still explaining to Officer Reynolds how she had been attacked while performing her HOA duties. When she saw me approaching in full uniform, the county sheriff's badge prominent on my chest, her rehearsed story faltered mid-sentence. Sheriff Davis, Officer Reynolds nodded respectfully. We were just getting Ms. Matthews' statement about what happened. Karen's eyes darted between my uniform and my face, realization dawning that the father of the girl she had injured was not just any resident. I was their boss, the highest law enforcement authority in the county. In that moment, the father and the sheriff within me merged into something formidable. Officer Reynolds, I want statements from all witnesses, photographs of the scene, and the weapon secured as evidence, I said, my voice deadly calm despite the rage building inside me. Ms. Matthews, you have made a terrible mistake today. The fluorescent lights of County General Hospital cast harsh shadows across Emma's pale face as doctors examined her wound. Dr. Patel, who had been treating Emma's muscular dystrophy since we moved to the area, studied the laceration with concern etched across her features. The cut itself is not life-threatening, she explained as nurses prepared to clean and suture the wound. But with Emma's condition, there are complications we need to consider. The location across the intercostal muscles is particularly concerning given her already compromised muscular structure. I stood at Emma's bedside, still in my uniform, listening as medical terminology flowed between the healthcare professionals. Words like fascial layer, potential infection risk, and compromised healing capacity punctuated their discussion. Will this affect her mobility? I asked, watching Emma wince as the nurse applied a local anesthetic. Dr. Patel nodded gravely. There will likely be a setback in her physical therapy progress. The muscles that have been damaged are ones she relies on heavily for stability when walking. Additionally, the trauma may cause inflammation that could exacerbate her underlying condition. Emma looked up at me, her eyes reflecting physical pain and deeper emotional wounds. My garden, she whispered. Dad, she destroyed everything. I squeezed her hand gently. We will rebuild it better than before, I promise. While Emma underwent treatment, I stepped into the hallway to speak with Officer Reynolds, who had followed the ambulance to the hospital to continue the investigation. Several witnesses contradict Ms. Matthews' self-defense claim, Reynolds reported, flipping through his notepad. Mrs. Miller across the street had the clearest view. She states Ms. Matthews entered your property uninvited and began destroying plants. When your daughter attempted to stop her, Matthews turned suddenly with the shears still open in her hand, cutting Emma across the ribs. I nodded, processing the information with the professional detachment I had developed over years in law enforcement. And Matthews' statement. She claims she had authority as HOA president to enter the property and remove non-compliant vegetation after proper notification periods had elapsed. She states Emma became aggressive and threatening, forcing her to defend herself. However, none of the witnesses support this version of events. The hospital waiting area bustled with activity, nurses hurrying between rooms, families anxiously awaiting news of loved ones. Through the large windows separating the waiting area from the main corridor, I spotted Karen Matthews speaking with two uniformed officers from my department. Her hands moved animatedly as she recounted her version of events, positioning herself as the victim of an unstable teenager. I watched as recognition dawned on her face when she spotted me through the glass. Her rehearsed narrative faltered mid-sentence, eyes darting between my uniform and the treatment room where Emma lay. The officers turned to follow her gaze, nodding respectfully when they saw me. Karen's expression transformed from righteous indignation to uncertainty as the power dynamic shifted. The realization that she had injured the daughter of the county sheriff, not just any resident, visibly shook her composure. Later that afternoon, as Emma rested following her treatment, I met with Diane Robertson, an attorney specializing in disability rights law. In her wood-paneled office, surrounded by legal texts and framed credentials, we reviewed the facts of the case. "This is not just about trespassing and assault," Robertson explained, organizing photographs of Emma's garden before and after Karen's destruction. "This is about disability discrimination and failure to provide reasonable accommodations as required by the Americans with Disabilities Act." She laid out medical reports next to the HOA violation notices. The therapeutic garden was a medically necessary accommodation for Emma's condition. The documentation from her physical therapist clearly establishes this. The HOA's refusal to acknowledge this need, followed by the destruction of the accommodation and subsequent injury, creates a compelling case. I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of both professional and personal responsibilities. I need to recuse myself from the official investigation to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Robertson nodded understandingly. "That is wise, but your position gives you insight into how systems fail people with disabilities. This case has the potential to create meaningful change in how HOAs interact with residents who have special needs." As evening fell, I returned to Emma's hospital room. The doctors had decided to keep her overnight for observation, concerned about potential complications given her condition. She slept fitfully, pain medication taking the edge off her discomfort but not eliminating it completely. Sitting beside her bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, I realized this case transcended our personal injury. It represented a systemic failure to protect vulnerable residents from arbitrary and discriminatory rules. As both a father and the county sheriff, I was uniquely positioned to address these failures. Karen Matthews had made a grave error in judgment. She had targeted the wrong family, unaware that her actions would not only harm an innocent girl, but also expose years of HOA overreach and discrimination. The legal wheels were now in motion, and no amount of HOA bylaws could protect her from the consequences of her actions. The community center buzzed with tension 1 week after the incident. Every seat was filled, with additional residents standing along the walls. The emergency HOA meeting had drawn the largest attendance in neighborhood history. As Emma and I entered, conversations hushed momentarily before resuming with increased intensity. We had returned home from the hospital 3 days earlier, Emma moving carefully to avoid pulling at her stitches. The garden remained in ruins, yellow caution tape marking it as part of an ongoing investigation. Each time Emma looked out her window at the destruction, her eyes filled with tears that she quickly tried to hide from me. Karen Matthews sat at the front table alongside other HOA board members. She wore a conservative navy blue dress and pearl necklace, the picture of suburban respectability. When she called the meeting to order, Her voice carried practiced authority that had likely intimidated residents for years. "We are here to address the unfortunate incident that occurred last week," Karen began, shuffling papers importantly. "As you know, maintaining our community standards is critical to preserving property values and neighborhood aesthetics." She clicked a remote, and images of various violations throughout the neighborhood appeared on the projection screen. The HOA bylaws exist to protect all homeowners. When regulations are ignored, the board has a responsibility to enforce compliance. A slideshow of our garden appeared next. Photos taken over several weeks showing the raised beds, trellises, and accessibility modifications Emma needed for her therapy. Karen presented each as evidence of blatant disregard for community standards rather than necessary medical accommodations. When verbal and written notices went unheeded, Karen continued, remediation became necessary. During this standard procedure, an unfortunate accident occurred when the Davis girl became confrontational and aggressive. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I felt Emma tense beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. "This is outrageous," someone called from the back. "She trespassed and assaulted a disabled child." Karen's smile remained fixed. "I understand emotions are running high, but we must consider the facts. The HOA has legal authority to address violations after proper notification periods have elapsed." When my turn to speak came, I approached the podium slowly, deliberately still wearing my sheriff's uniform despite being off duty. The room fell silent, not from intimidation but from respect and anticipation. "Many of you know me as Sheriff Davis," I began. "Tonight, I speak primarily as Emma's father. My daughter has muscular dystrophy, a condition that causes progressive weakness and chronic pain. The garden that Ms. Matthews destroyed was designed by medical professionals as therapeutic treatment." I connected my laptop to the projector and played security camera footage from our home system. Footage that clearly showed Karen entering our property uninvited, methodically destroying plants, and the moment the shears cut across Emma's ribs as she tried to protect her sanctuary. Gasps echoed through the room as the video played. Karen's face drained of color. "This was not an accident," I stated firmly. "This was trespassing, destruction of property, and assault. More fundamentally, it was discrimination against a person with disabilities." What happened next surprised even me. Mrs. Miller, the elderly neighbor who had witnessed the incident, stood shakily from her seat. "Karen has been doing this for years," she announced. "When my husband needed a wheelchair ramp after his stroke, she fined us weekly until we removed it." One by one, neighbors rose to share similar stories. A family denied permission for a therapeutic swimming pool for their son with cerebral palsy. Another fined for installing grab bars by their front steps. A widow penalized for having groceries delivered too frequently when she could no longer drive. Then Michael Chen, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat nervously. "I feel I need to clarify something. The board never authorized Ms. Matthews to enter properties or remove structures. That exceeds the authority granted to the HOA president under our bylaws." Other board members nodded in agreement, creating distance between themselves and Karen's actions. "Furthermore," Chen continued, shuffling through a folder, "I have discovered that Ms. Matthews has been selectively enforcing rules against residents who miss meetings or question her authority. I have compiled documentation showing a clear pattern of targeted enforcement." The room erupted in conversation. Karen attempted to regain control, banging her gavel repeatedly, but the tide had turned. Years of quiet suffering under her tyrannical rule had finally found collective voice. By meeting's end, the HOA board had voted to suspend Karen from her position pending investigation, appointed an interim president, and established a committee to review and revise bylaws regarding medical accommodations and disability access. As we prepared to leave, residents surrounded Emma and me, offering support and sharing contact information to testify if needed. The community had physically reorganized, no longer divided between Karen's supporters and victims, but united in determination to create a more inclusive neighborhood for all residents. Emma looked up at me, a small smile forming for the first time since the incident. "Dad," she whispered, "I think something good might come from this after all. The garden could be replanted. The HOA rules could be reformed. But most importantly, a community that had suffered silently under discriminatory leadership had found its voice." The courthouse stood imposing against the clear blue sky, its limestone facade weathered by decades of sun and rain. Emma and I climbed the wide steps slowly, her movements still careful 3 weeks after the incident. She wore a conservative blue dress, her hair neatly braided, looking younger than her 16 years. Inside, the wood-paneled courtroom already hummed with activity. The district attorney, Marion Wells, had taken a personal interest in the case. As we entered, she approached with a warm smile, bending slightly to address Emma directly. "You doing okay today?" Wells asked gently. "Remember, just tell the truth about what happened. Your voice matters in that witness box." Emma nodded, her nervousness evident but determination stronger. "I can do this," she replied quietly. I had recused myself from the official investigation immediately, ensuring there could be no accusations of impropriety or conflict of interest. Deputy Chief Rodriguez had overseen the case, working closely with the DA's office to build a comprehensive case against Karen Matthews. The charges were substantial: assault with a deadly weapon, trespassing, destruction of property, and civil rights violations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The courtroom was packed, not just with neighbors, but also representatives from disability rights organizations and local media. This case had transcended our personal experience to become a referendum on how communities accommodate their vulnerable members. Karen Matthews entered flanked by her attorney, a polished woman in an expensive suit from a prestigious law firm in the city. Karen had traded her usual tennis attire and perfectly styled hair for a conservative gray suit and minimal makeup, clearly attempting to project an image of reasonable authority rather than aggressive entitlement. As proceedings began, the prosecutor methodically presented the case. Enlarged photographs of Emma's injuries appeared on screens throughout the courtroom. The medical examiner testified about the severity of the wound and the compounding factors of Emma's muscular dystrophy. "In a patient with this condition," Dr. Patel explained, "an injury that crosses the intercostal muscles presents significantly greater complications than in a typical patient. The laceration interfered with her existing physical therapy regimen and created setbacks in her mobility management." When the security camera footage played, showing the moment the shears cut across Emma's ribs, several jurors visibly winced. The sound system captured Emma's cry of pain with terrible clarity. Karen sat stiffly beside her attorney, eyes fixed forward, avoiding looking at the evidence of what she had done. Her defense strategy became clear as her attorney cross-examined witnesses. She would claim HOA authority to enter the property and insist the injury was accidental, occurring only when Emma became aggressive. This narrative fell apart when timestamps from the security footage, were compared with text messages recovered from Karen's phone. Messages sent to other HOA board members the day before the incident revealed premeditation. Taking care of the Davis violation tomorrow. Will document removal of non-compliant structures. Board members testified that they never authorized Karen to enter properties or remove structures. Michael Chen, the HOA treasurer, presented documentation showing Karen's pattern of selective enforcement against residents with medical needs or disabilities who had requested accommodations. In the past 3 years, 27 requests for medical accommodations were submitted to the HOA, Chen testified. 25 were denied under Ms. Matthews' leadership, despite many having strong documentation of necessity. The most powerful moment came when Emma took the stand. Her voice, initially shaking but growing stronger with each question, described not just the physical pain of her injury, but the deeper wound of losing her therapeutic garden. "Those plants were not just plants to me," she explained, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Each one represented a goal I had reached in physical therapy. The sunflowers, I planted them when I could barely stand for 5 minutes. I watched them grow taller as I grew stronger." She described how gardening allowed her to build strength without the clinical feeling of medical exercises. "In physical therapy, I am reminded of my limitations. In my garden, I focus on what I can create despite them." Karen avoided eye contact throughout Emma's testimony, her gaze fixed on her folded hands. Only when expert witnesses from disability rights organizations began explaining how her actions violated federal law did she sh. Our reaction, a tightening of her lips, a flush creeping up her neck. "The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations," explained Dr. Lawrence, a specialist in disability law. "A therapeutic garden recommended by medical professionals clearly constitutes such an accommodation. The willful destruction of this accommodation, following documented requests for exception to HOA rules, demonstrates a pattern of discrimination." As the day's proceedings ended and we prepared to leave, I noticed a shift in how reporters covered the story. What had begun as a sensational tale of a neighborhood dispute had evolved into serious examination of how homeowners associations across the country were failing to accommodate residents with disabilities. This case was becoming larger than Karen Matthews, larger than our family's trauma. It was shining light on systemic failures that affected countless families struggling against arbitrary rules that failed to account for human needs and medical necessities. Morning light filtered through new curtains Emma had chosen for her bedroom window, curtains that offered a clear view of her rebuilt garden. 6 months had passed since the verdict. Karen Matthews had been found guilty on all charges: assault with a deadly weapon, trespassing, destruction of property, and civil rights violations. The sentence had been substantial: 2 years in prison, suspended to 6 months served plus 5 years probation, mandatory community service with disability organizations, and significant financial restitution. The civil case that followed resulted in additional damages that funded not just the rebuilding of Emma's garden, but similar therapeutic gardens for other residents with disabilities throughout the county. I watched from the kitchen window as Emma moved through her new garden, her movements stronger and more confident than they had been in years. The trauma had set back her physical therapy progress temporarily, but her determination had turned recovery into triumph. The garden now featured improved accessibility with paved pathways, ergonomic tools, and raised beds at varying heights to accommodate different mobility levels. What struck me most was not the physical transformation of the space, but the community involvement in creating it. The same neighbors who had once stood silently by as Karen Matthews enforced arbitrary rules had rallied around Emma. Weekend after weekend, they had appeared with tools and plants, following the designs created by Emma and her physical therapist. Mrs. Miller now sat daily on the new community bench installed at the garden's edge, often joined by other elderly residents who found the peaceful setting therapeutic for their own health challenges. Children from the neighborhood came regularly to learn about plants from Emma, who had discovered a talent for teaching. Across town, Karen's house stood empty, a sold sign recently placed where the FOR sale sign had stood for months. She had moved away immediately after completing her jail sentence, unable to face the community where her reputation was irredeemably damaged. I had seen her only once since the trial, packing the last of her belongings into a moving truck, her once perfect appearance now haggard and defeated. Our final interaction had been brief but significant. I had approached her driveway, not out of malice but a professional need for closure. "Ms. Matthews," I called as she prepared to enter her car. She turned, startled, her expression hardening when she recognized me. "Sheriff Davis, have you come to gloat?" "No," I replied calmly. "I came to let you know that the county has implemented new oversight regulations for all homeowners associations. Medical accommodations can no longer be denied without review by an independent committee that includes healthcare professionals." She stared at me, comprehension slowly dawning. "Because of me." "Because of Emma," I corrected. "Your actions caused tremendous pain, but they also exposed systematic problems that needed addressing. The changes will help countless families." Karen nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged understanding rather than remorse, before driving away from Oak Ridge Estates for the final time. Back at the county building, the new ordinances had indeed been enacted. As sheriff, I had worked with county commissioners to establish oversight committees for HOA compliance with accessibility laws. What began as a personal injury had sparked county-wide reform that was already being examined by neighboring jurisdictions as a model policy. The most profound change, however, was within our community itself. The HOA continued to function, but under new leadership focused on building community rather than enforcing conformity. Monthly meetings now included representatives from disability advocacy groups and medical professionals who advised on accommodation requests. As evening approached, I changed from my uniform into casual clothes and joined Emma in the garden. She was hosting a small gathering of friends, some from her support group for teens with disabilities, others from her school. They sat in a circle on the accessible patio we had installed, sharing stories and laughter that carried across the peaceful yard. "Dad," Emma called, waving me over. "Come meet Sarah. She just moved into the neighborhood. Her family is building a therapeutic pool for her arthritis, and the HOA Accessibility Committee fast-tracked the approval." I shook hands with a smiling girl about Emma's age, noting the careful way she moved, similar to my daughter's measured gestures. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," I said warmly. "You will find this is a community that values all its members." As the sun set over the garden, casting long shadows across the flowers and vegetables that represented Emma's continuing recovery, I reflected on how adversity had transformed not just our family, but an entire community. What began as one person's cruel enforcement of arbitrary rules had evolved into a movement that rippled outward, creating protected spaces for all residents regardless of ability. Emma's garden had become more than a place of physical therapy. It had become a symbol of inclusion, of standing against discrimination, and of a community finding its moral compass when confronted with injustice.